Welcome back, AP. All right, so let's pick up where we left off in class on Friday. We were talking about like the changing social hierarchies and kind of just like life, like basic life factors during the Renaissance, right? So a big thing we haven't talked about, we've talked about like women during the Renaissance and the views on education of them. We've talked about basically the growing rights of men during the Renaissance, like the growing middle class, like the idea that you're actually like more national identity, things like that. One people we haven't talked about is like the ideas on race and slavery, right? So now, first and foremost, there were only a very, very few African descendant people that actually resided in Europe around 1450 forward. Now, most were brought over as slaves, along with larger groups of actually white slaves as well. Now, starts in the Middle Ages with the Eastern European slaves and Northern Africans. So, most of when you consider slavery, when you're talking about bicolorism and things like that, you usually think of like vestiges of the Old South and mostly African slaves and the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the thing about that entire system is that actually that didn't begin until much later. Most of your slaves during the 1450s were actually like Eastern European slaves, like close to the borders of Turkey, areas of current day Georgia, southern Russia, areas like that, close towards the Balkans, and Northern African slaves as well, like Libyans, Moroccans, which is actually when they usually used to refer in most Middle Ages, when they would say Moors, they would actually, that means Moroccan, short for Moroccan. So a lot of different concepts of that. And then also the really quick thing, if you actually had African slaves during the Renaissance, it's actually going to become kind of an odd point of pride. Like this woman right here, this is actually by an artist named Titian, Titian. This woman Titian was very well known for a lot of like kind of breaking the mold Renaissance style things, larger, more broad brushstrokes, almost impressionist kind of feelings. He also loved to do paintings of the washing of Christ's feet, which was a big one as well. But in this particular piece, the African child that is a slave of hers is actually with her to try and demonstrate her wealth, right? So, which is a really screwed up thing. Now, continuing though, slavery is not even going to begin to boom in Europe until after the fall of the Byzantine in 1453. So, underline fall of Byzantine, you can also call it the fall of Constantinople. What's going to happen in 1453 though is that rule of the area of like what you think of the gateway to the Middle East, modern day Turkey, is going to pass to the Ottomans, right? Ottoman, right? And that's in 1453. Just like underline that date. 1453 is a massively important date in European history. So the fall of the Byzantine and the passing of that like area of the Mediterranean to the Ottomans. Now, Portuguese traders are also then going to begin to bring slaves back with them after the spice trade actually begins to hold up, and then as well. Just to give you some statistics, by 1500, about 1,000 slaves a year were brought to Portugal. By 1530, it's going to like go up 10 times to like actually 10,000 a year. Following the successful voyage of Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope and all the way to like Western India to actually pick spices up. We'll talk about like this crazy story about Vasco da Gama, and he like sends a gift basket, if you will, to one of the governors in India. Now, continuing forward though, political instability and cost provided like a very large number of slaves, right? Now, some Africans are going to intermarry with Europeans and also make it as far north as Northern Europe and not just in Iberia. So to give you also a slight premise as well, just so you understand, again, you got to separate yourself from the plantation economics idea of slavery in the New World, because that's not going to begin until much later. In the 1400s and 1500s, actually one big thing that slaves were required to have Sunday off, because most of these countries all these countries are Catholic, right? And so they had to keep the Sabbath day holy, so no labor was allowed to be done in like these areas. Also, these slaves would be baptized as Catholic. And another big thing that the French and the Spanish are going to introduce is they encourage slaves to work extra hours, get paid, and then buy their freedom as a form of motivation. So some of these slaves are going to actually buy their freedom, and they're going to immigrate as far north as Northern Europe, intermarry with other white Europeans. Now, Elizabeth was not so polite when she referred to the status along with black slaves and dwarves, talking about how no matter what, their status was going to still be lower. So people of minority and African descendant races were still treated as a disenfranchised community in Europe, regardless of the fact that they were able to actually move through the continent. Now, large-scale agricultural slavery isn't going to develop until the 1600s, and like when you actually look at the ideas of the New World, right? So slaves are going to be used to do everything else, though, in European cities. We're talking like usually house servants, actually assistants for craftsmen and trade workers, and also the Catholic Church, unfortunately, is going to condone the slave trade later on because they believe that it's actually improving the lives of the Africans, which is a very, very messed up thing. The silent condemnation of the slave trade by the Catholic Church is actually one of the black marks on the history of the church itself. It's actually one of the things that the Catholic Church in the past has actually apologized for. Now, also, though, some of these Africans are actually going to learn trades, become actually very profitable. Some people, for our example, reference one African that actually was descendant of other Africans in Europe is Alexander Dumas, who actually wrote The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo, who was actually also who was an African man living in Europe. So some of them actually leap forward and actually redefine some parts of our art and literature as well, which is a huge, huge advent. Now, moving forward, we're going to talk about like wealth and nobility. So in the Middle Ages, society was divided into orders, right? So the orders were actually like known as those who work, those who pray, those who fight, wealthy merchants included. Don't write this stuff down. It's not that important, all right? I know some of y'all probably already paused me and wrote it down anyway, but that was a rookie mistake, all right? It's not that important. This is just trying to give you an idea of how like things are going to change a lot, right? So Middle-aged society was very, very like strict. Those who work, those who pray, those who fight, right? So wealthy merchants and your higher nobles are included somewhere in there, but nobles are also an even higher order, even if they had no money, right? So let's say hypothetically, because we talked about this when we were talking about like the AP lead up to the Renaissance. How do you measure wealth again in the Middle Ages? Very good. One of the biggest things is, Dion, I appreciate you saying that, land holdings, right? So you could have no money as a noble, but still be considered a higher order due to the fact that you held a large tract of land, right? So this isn't also a really neat thing. Just write this down real quick. The concept of honor was a very, very interesting concept as well, that there were also, like, as the Renaissance lurches forward, certain jobs were looked upon as, like, dishonorable. So this is just an interesting shift in Middle Age dynamics because if you were a part of the group of those who work, you never actually were considered to be dishonorable job holdings, right? However, Renaissance culture is going to like widen itself further and include, because due to the proliferation of guilds being much easier to get into, due to the fact that the middle class is growing and is much easier to get into, that actually lower class people are going to be looked upon with like dishonorable jobs, like a brothel owner, because actually brothel owners were well known during the Middle Ages for receiving payment for a father's. If a man had a very big debt at a brothel, he could give one of his daughters as payment, which is really messed up. And then also, executioners, following the Middle Ages going into the Renaissance, always wore hoods because it was believed to be a dishonorable job. They actually wore the hood so they could mask their face. And then also the yellow bands, right? The yellow bands was a really big thing that in many Renaissance towns, they actually forced prostitutes to wear yellow bands around their arms, symbolizing the fires of hell. So very intense stuff, right? This is also really, really important. So Renaissance culture, classes, and societies are going to begin to expand and grow. So we're going to add more to this, right? It's no longer now those who work, those who pray, those who fight. It's now going to get into the fact that the nobility is beginning to shrink. The middle class is beginning to grow. You're looking at the seedlings of these groups of people known as your bourgeoisie, right? So ruling class is going to desire more power, which is huge. Like, just go ahead and all this is super important. This is all very important because one of the biggest things about the AP test is they love to test on this thing called continuity and change over time, right? One of the biggest, the Renaissance marks that change in society, right? The growing middle class, the lessening power of the nobility, and the ruling class looking to expand. Because up to this point, if you looked at like your trinity of ruling groups in Europe, you've got your royals, your royal family, like kings, queens, dukes, stuff like that. You've got your nobles over here, and then you've got your church over here, right? The papacy. The thing about the papacy is during like the mid-1500s, the Reformation is just going to like completely crush their ability to like rule larger areas like they always wanted to. So it's going to turn into a fight between your monarchies and your nobles, right? So the thing about the the monarchies is they're immediately going to look to try and shift power, right? So the Middle Ages was riddled with wars between nobles and rulers, weakening the power of the rulers. The two best examples of the fact that the monarchy was much weaker during the Middle Ages are the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses, right? The 100 Years' War was literally a war over basically a chair, right? Edward III fights Philip VI to try and get rule over the French throne because Edward was blood related to the death of the French king at the time. But the French nobles are going to give the kingship to Philip VI, which was a distant cousin, right? Mainly because they didn't want an English man on the throne of France. So, like, that's a huge issue right there, talking about, like, national identity, wars between nobles and, like, rulers, and it's just going to weaken the power of the monarchies. The War of the Roses was a huge one because it's literally two noble families fighting over the throne, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, right? And the House of York is going to end up winning and installing the Tudor regime. So monarchies, the big thing is, during the Renaissance or the beginnings of these big shifts, they're seeking to grow in power, right? And they're trying to get to that absolutist era of like Louis XIV. So the two methods that they want to do, all right? I need you to listen closely. You're going to have to write something that's not necessarily on the screen, all right? The two methods they wanted to use to do that, number one, they want to weaken the power of the nobles, all right? They're going to do this by like professionalizing armies, increasing taxes, right? Things like that, okay? So put those two like bullet points underneath there. And then they want to weaken the reach of the church, right? So they want to weaken the reach of the church by installing local bishops and abbots on the king's terms, right? The king wants to be allowed to pick their church officials, where the papacy for the entirety of the Middle Ages did not allow that, period. The Pope and the Council of Cardinals were in charge of selecting bishops by countries. Obstacles for royals, though, that's going to happen, number one, is a small military because they actually don't have professional armies yet, and communication. You couldn't text the Pope actually really quickly and say, well, you know, I want to like install my own bishops. So communication was a big thing. Small military was a big thing. Those are their obstacles in the Renaissance. These things will change wildly when we hit like the 1600s. Now, easy examples of the struggle for power, you do not need to write these down. The Spider King was a big one. That's King Louis XII, right? Then there was the entire thing between Leo X and Louis XII. The Spider King was actually very well known for installing two huge. That actually might be Henry IV. Is that? Yeah. So the Spider King was well known for actually installing two taxes to weaken the nobles, called the it's a land tax and a salt tax that actually like carried over in France all the way up until their revolution. And so Leo X and Medici Pope actually allowing Louis XII to select his own bishops, which was a big compromise, the two of them, the War of the Roses. But the thing about it that we're going to talk about, this is very, very important. The attempt of Spain to grow their power and the power of their monarchy is best seen in the Spanish Inquisition, right? And I'm going to try and keep this a little on the shorter side because no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So the struggle for power in Spain all started with the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, right? You know these people. Everybody knows Isabella and Ferdinand. They're the two people that are going to send Columbus on his voyage, right? Of course. So they're also going to give birth to this guy named Philip II, who is then going to marry this woman named Joanna the Mad, and then they're going to produce Charles V, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So Spain was organized into a loose confederation of states. They weren't even a giant unified country. Now, the nobles, though, they're going to try and, Isabella and Ferdinand are going to try and weaken the power of the nobles. Because remember, there are two things that every royal wants to do. They want to weaken the power of the nobles, weaken the reach of the church, right? Remember, put stars next to those things. Weaken the power of the nobles, weaken the reach of the church. So, nobles, they're going to do that by barring higher nobles from councils and courts and install lesser nobles. They're doing that to create a power struggle between wealthier nobles and lower base nobles, right? So they're actually going to install lesser nobles into their councils and bar higher nobles from councils with the king and queen to try and weaken their strength, right? Give more power to these lesser nobles because they will work harder for your approval. Now the church, they're going to appoint their own bishops under the proposition of bringing in the Inquisition, right? So the goal of the Spanish Inquisition under these two was actually the whole idea of purity. Most people think that it's actually to find heretics and sniff out heresy. The thing about it was in Spain at the time, it was known as the Reconquista, right? The Reconquista was this idea of pushing out two populations of people, Muslims and Jews, right? So that's who they wanted to push out. The Jews and the Muslims of Spain, before this entire thing, the Jews were only allowed to live in certain areas. However, their areas and their culture, Rufio, get away from the trash. Like their culture denoted a very high efficacy on education and also craft work. So their wealth grew very quickly. So, like, for example, most people in Spain, if you were a wealthier noble, they usually went to Jewish doctors, and they usually went to Jewish jewelers and bankers and things like that. Oh, it's a baby. And then the Muslims, though, they lived in the south of Spain since the Middle Ages because they took that area over during their golden age, right? So the Middle Ages was, for Europe, was a golden age for the nation of Islam, okay? And speaking of that, though, so it was a golden age for the nation of Islam. Now, the thing about it is they are going to take over the south of Spain. So a big part of the Reconquista is they're going to try and push the Muslims out of southern Spain. Okay, and they actually succeed in doing that. Isabella and Ferdinand send a very large army to push the Muslims out. Now, the church, though, is going to turn against them. And, like, the big thing about it, what I mean by that is the church is going to turn against the Jewish people, not against Isabella and Ferdinand. That seems really confusing. So the church is going to turn their focus against the Jews after the Muslims have been pushed out using military force, right? Sermons are going to be very fiery and lash out at the economic advantages of the Jewish community. And so 40% of the Jewish population in Spain is going to be forced to convert or killed. Now, a converso literally means in Spanish, new Christian. That's your Jews that were forced to convert, right? So we haven't even gotten to the Spanish Inquisition yet because it hasn't really started yet. Because all this stuff is like a lead up to it, okay? So you could put like lead up to the Spanish Inquisition. Sorry about it, this is confusing. This is, again, how my brain works, right? So the resentment is going to continue, though, towards conversos, because conversos still held power. Just because you got them to convert does not mean that they're not still making large amounts of money, doing craft work, doing things like that, and living in their communities. So then comes in the Spanish Inquisition to hunt down and punish these false Christians. So a lot of like people in their Christian communities are going to accuse some of these conversos of, oh, hey, when's the last time you ate pork? If you're not eating pork, that means you're not a real Christian, right? So 200,000 Jews that actually live in Spain at the time, 150,000 of them are going to flee Spain because of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was literally best known for its torture devices, which we will talk a little bit about on Monday, because you got to look at those in person. All right, like the torture devices were to get them to confess to not being a good Christian, right? To being a fake Christian, to being a bad converso. So 200,000 Jews lived in Spain before the real hardships of the Spanish Inquisition started. 150,000 of them fled. The torture devices were meant to hunt down these people. A lot of baptisms were forced, atrocities committed, and their daughter, though, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, is going to produce a Habsburg heir known as Charles V. Just kind of underline that and start a little bit. It comes up much more in the future, all right? So last thing we got to talk about is the Renaissance papacy under Nicholas V. Nicholas V is the first Renaissance pope, and he is going to patron the art and the revitalization of Rome, and it's going to grow in power and wealth among the higher ranks of the clergy. Now, that's what we're mainly getting at is like this, the whole objective of this slide is just to say the Catholic Church condoned the Renaissance and participated in it. They patroned arts, they beautified churches, they did all these things to try and give Rome a better look of pristineness and trying to bring it back to its former glory, right? Jules Bear, I know you and I talked about this at one point, that Rome was a shadow of itself. It's beginning the Renaissance. Well, Nicholas V is going to be the guy to try and bring Rome back to its glory in its looks and its participation in the Renaissance. Their population in Rome actually grew from like a meager 17,000 or something like that in 1450, and is going to grow by 1550 to like 85,000. It's insane. I don't know if those numbers are dead on the money. I'll double check if I'm wrong and let you know on Monday. But yeah, that's it. So we just wrapped up the Renaissance like that, okay? So very, very good job today. I appreciate that, y'all. I know this one's a little bit longer, but it's AP. Get over it. All right, so good stuff, though. We'll talk a little bit more about this on Monday, but we're going to start reviewing on Monday and Tuesday because there's a lot of info. All right, I'll see you guys then. Have a good one.